The heavy glass doors of the corporate boardroom whispered shut behind her as she stepped in, her posture steady yet unassuming. Around the long, polished mahogany table, sharp-suited executives paused mid-conversation. Their eyes, cold and calculating, landed on the woman whose modest dress and gentle accent did not match the grandeur of the room. She carried no expensive briefcase, wore no designer label, and her soft-spoken greeting carried the distinct melody of an accent that made some eyebrows rise. For a heartbeat, silence lingered in the room, heavy with quiet judgment. A few exchanged glances, subtle smirks playing at the corners of their mouths. One of the younger men shifted in his seat, barely masking his chuckle as he leaned toward his colleague. "Lost the way to catering?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to catch but quiet enough to pretend innocence. A wave of restrained laughter rippled through the group, their eyes following her every step as she walked towards the far end of the table. The contrast was sharp. She, with her simple attire and unfamiliar tone, seemed to exist out of place in the sea of tailored suits and practiced arrogance. Every wall in the room gleamed, the air-conditioned chill a stark reminder of power dynamics at play. Yet she moved with a calm that felt almost unsettling in its certainty. She did not shrink under their gazes. Her back remained straight, her pace even, as if she belonged more than anyone else in that space. When she spoke again, a polite but firm question about the agenda, her accent wrapped around the words gracefully. Instead of listening, some members of the board exchanged another round of thinly veiled smiles, as though her voice alone validated their assumptions about her place, or lack thereof, in this gathering of decision-makers. Still, she stood, unflinching. There was not a flicker of discomfort on her face, no trace of insecurity in her eyes. Behind the shallow laughter and hushed remarks, a question lingered unspoken, shared among the faces in the room. Who was she, and what boldness brought her here? Her eyes swept briefly across the table, and for a fleeting second, they landed on the head seat reserved for leadership. The confidence in her glance, quiet but unmistakable, momentarily unsettled those paying attention. It was not the look of someone out of place. It was the look of someone assessing her rightful position. Despite the dismissive glances and snide comments, she remained a portrait of quiet dignity. She did not flinch when a senior executive casually suggested she should wait outside for directives, implying she might have misunderstood her role. She met his gaze evenly, offering no defensive reply, allowing the weight of his prejudice to hang in the air unanswered. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, as if an unseen storm was gathering strength beneath the surface. A few seats down, an assistant lowered her gaze awkwardly, sensing the discomfort rising like heat in the room. But the others pressed on, their dismissiveness growing bolder with each passing moment. More remarks surfaced, this time less disguised, as though her silence invited their ridicule. Yet she absorbed every slight without reaction, her composed demeanor quietly deflecting their attempts to unsettle her. It was this very composure that began to shift something subtle in the atmosphere. While the voices in the room grew louder, her presence grew heavier, more pronounced. Though they laughed at her, they could not ignore her. Though they mocked her accent, they could not deny the calm authority that seemed to flow beneath her still exterior. There was something about the way she carried herself, something they could not quite place, that left a small nagging discomfort beneath their bravado. Her eyes, once again, found their way back to the head seat at the table, resting there a second longer this time. The room, though filled with sound, felt the weight of her silent assertion. She did not need to speak her intentions aloud. Her poise spoke for her. She was not there by accident. She was not lost. And despite their attempts to reduce her presence to a momentary joke, she stood as an undeniable figure against the backdrop of their arrogance. The comments, once hushed behind polite veneers, grew bolder as the minutes passed. What had begun as smirks and quiet jabs now evolved into louder, more pointed remarks. Her accent became the centerpiece of their ridicule, twisted and mimicked, with exaggerated inflections. Some even went as far as to toss mocking suggestions about which department she had mistakenly wandered from. It was as if her calm presence, instead of dissolving their assumptions, only fueled their determination to put her in her place. From the head of the table, a senior executive cleared his throat with affected authority. "Perhaps someone from admin can help her find the correct meeting room," he announced, barely hiding the disdain beneath his forced smile. A few chuckles followed, bouncing off the cold walls of the room like echoes of superiority. Another chimed in, suggesting with faux concern that she might be looking for the HR department. After all, they speculated, that was likely the only reason someone like her would step foot in such an important strategy meeting. Yet she did not waver. She stood with a quiet composure that unsettled even as they tried to ignore its weight. Her eyes, steady and observant, took in every mocking face, every dismissive tone, without the faintest flicker of defense. She let them speak, let them pile assumptions upon assumptions, revealing far more about themselves than they realized. Her silence was not weakness. It was strength in its purest form, a refusal to dignify their prejudice with argument. The deeper they sank into their ridicule, the clearer her dignity shone. A quiet respect began to rise, not from those leading the mockery, but from the few in the room who watched with growing discomfort. Among them, a junior analyst shifted uneasily in his chair, his gaze darting between her composed stance and the faces of his superiors. Something didn't sit right. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a weight to her presence, a quiet authority beneath her reserved demeanor that gnawed at his instincts. As the discussion moved clumsily to the company's current crisis, the tone became more serious, but the exclusion continued. They spoke as though she were invisible, as though her presence was merely an irritating background distraction. The executive at the head of the table sighed heavily, lamenting falling profits, declining morale, and a leadership void that had left the company drifting. His words carried frustration, but none in the room seemed equipped with real solutions. She listened closely, every word absorbed with an intensity that escaped their notice. They presumed she could not possibly understand the complexities of their challenges. Yet, as they detailed figures and projections, she subtly reacted to inaccuracies. The smallest arch of her brow at miscalculations, the faintest narrowing of her eyes at flawed strategies. She knew more than she let on, far more than they dared imagine. The junior staffer, sensing the depth in her quiet observation, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "Are we sure she's not someone important?" His voice was tight with concern, but the response was a dismissive wave of the hand. "She's probably just part of the admin pool. Don't overthink it." His concern, like her silent authority, was brushed aside without thought. As the meeting dragged on, tension beneath the surface stretched taut. She continued to stand her ground, poised yet unassuming, her gaze never faltering. Every shallow comment and ignorant slight seemed to carve deeper into the room's collective discomfort. Though they pretended indifference, a few began to feel an invisible pressure tightening around them, the creeping sense that they were making a mistake, a grave one. Her hands, gently clasped in front of her, did not tremble. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unwavering. She was a pillar amidst a storm of arrogance. The more they attempted to erode her presence, the more it solidified, like stone weathered smooth by relentless wind but never broken. Her calm refusal to play into their narrative forced an uncomfortable mirror upon them, reflecting their own smallness back at them. A glance exchanged between two mid-level managers revealed the first cracks in their facade of confidence. There was hesitation now, a flicker of doubt about their assumptions. How could someone stand so firmly beneath such scrutiny, unless there was more beneath the surface? The seed of curiosity had been planted, and it began to take quiet root. She shifted slightly, not out of nervousness, but as if preparing for something deliberate. Her gaze lifted once more, scanning the faces before her, each absorbed in their misplaced superiority. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency to defend herself, only the poised readiness of someone who knew exactly where she stood and why. The air in the room grew heavier with every breath, the earlier laughter fading into a strained quiet. For the first time, even the most dismissive voices found themselves momentarily silenced, as if instinctively aware of a shift too subtle to name. She drew in a measured breath, her eyes carrying the weight of unspoken truth, and prepared herself to speak. The moment her voice broke the heavy silence, it carried a tone so calm yet commanding that it shifted the air in the room. Eyes turned toward her, some with faint amusement still lingering, others with a flicker of curiosity that had been quietly growing. She spoke clearly, her accent still present but now wrapped around precise, informed statements that left no room for misunderstanding. Her words didn't hesitate. She outlined the recent quarterly downturn with exact numbers, named internal departments by their exact reporting structures, and referenced strategy proposals that had never been publicly shared. A subtle unease crept into the posture of the executives. Their earlier confidence wavered, replaced by quick, uncertain glances at one another. The bravado that had filled the room only moments before now thinned into discomfort. How did she know these details? How could someone they dismissed so easily possess insights reserved for the highest tiers of leadership? Her steady flow of information continued, revealing familiarity with vendor contracts, upcoming mergers, and confidential negotiations that only the inner circle had discussed behind closed doors. The temperature in the room, despite the steady hum of the air conditioner, seemed to climb. Chairs shifted. A few cleared their throats unnecessarily, as if to break the growing tension. She made no effort to acknowledge their confusion. Her focus remained on the facts, her delivery smooth and unwavering. It was not a performance meant to embarrass but a presentation of undeniable truth. Each sentence built upon the last, weaving a narrative of leadership and competence that could no longer be ignored. The executives, who moments before had ridiculed her, found themselves scrambling internally, their assumptions unraveling faster than they could mask their discomfort. One of the senior managers attempted to interrupt, his voice cracking slightly as he questioned her source of information. She paused just long enough to meet his gaze with quiet certainty before answering. That data comes directly from the last executive briefing, which I chaired. Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of realization across the faces in the room. Silence swallowed the space whole. Every eye fixed on her now, not with mockery, but with stunned recognition. The earlier smirks faded into tight lines of anxiety. Faces flushed with the weight of their mistake, their initial arrogance now a source of deep embarrassment. She let the silence linger, not out of spite, but to let the truth settle fully into the corners of the room. Without raising her voice, she revealed what no one had expected. She was not a guest, not an assistant, not an outsider who had mistakenly wandered into their domain. She was the newly appointed chief executive officer, entrusted by the board to lead the company into its next era. The announcement was not dramatic, nor did it need to be. It was delivered with the same steady composure she had maintained from the beginning, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A visible shift occurred as the weight of her position crushed the false confidence that had filled the room. Some swallowed hard, eyes dropping to the table in shame. Others stiffened in their seats, faces blank, as they struggled to process the depth of their error. The junior staff member who had sensed something earlier now watched her with quiet admiration, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Despite the satisfying reveal, she did not gloat. There was no need. Her poise alone was victory enough. She continued to speak of business, steering the conversation to immediate priorities, growth strategies, and the future of the organization. Her leadership presence filled the room completely, now undeniable and commanding. Every word she spoke rebuilt the shattered perceptions of the people before her. The arrogance that once clouded their judgment dissolved into reluctant respect. They began to see her not through the lens of prejudice, but through the clarity of undeniable competence. She had never needed to raise her voice or return their mockery. Her power had always been in her quiet command of truth. There was no awkward fanfare as she concluded her points, only a dignified pause as she stepped forward. Without hesitation, she walked to the head of the table, her rightful place from the very beginning. She pulled the chair back smoothly and took her seat with the effortless grace of someone who belonged there all along. The room, still silent, felt entirely transformed. No longer the space of exclusion and mockery, it now bore the imprint of her presence, reshaped by the revelation of her identity. Her steady gaze swept across the table, meeting every eye without flinching. In that moment, without a single boastful word, she reclaimed the space as her own, leaving no doubt of her authority. Her voice, calm yet resolute, filled the room with a quiet authority that needed no force. She began to outline her vision for the company, weaving her words with purpose and clarity. There was no bitterness in her tone, no hint of personal vendetta, only the steady focus of a leader who had long understood the weight of responsibility. She spoke of ethical leadership as not just an aspiration, but as a non-negotiable foundation for the company's future. Her eyes met theirs not with accusation, but with an invitation to reflection, to growth. She addressed the culture that had silently thrived within these walls, a culture that had allowed bias to slip between conversations and decisions unchecked. Without pointing fingers, she described how subtle judgments, careless remarks, and unchecked arrogance could corrode even the strongest of organizations. Her words were precise, landing softly yet carrying the full gravity of truth. Those who had mocked her earlier now felt the quiet sting of realization creep beneath their polished exteriors. No public shaming followed. She didn't need to expose anyone directly. Their own actions had already done that far better than any accusation could. As she continued, the natural consequences of their behavior unfolded before them. Department leads whose leadership had been clouded by prejudice found their roles under review, their authority questioned not out of vengeance, but necessity. Processes were to be audited, hiring practices scrutinized, and promotions re-evaluated with a fresh lens focused firmly on merit and integrity. The junior staff member who had, earlier in the meeting, recognized her presence and sensed something deeper, received a moment of well-earned acknowledgement. With a simple nod and a few well-chosen words, she praised his quiet professionalism, his attentiveness to what others had been too arrogant to notice. His eyes brightened, a subtle sign that integrity did not go unseen in this new chapter of the company's life. As her plans unfolded, the atmosphere in the room shifted from stunned silence to thoughtful reflection. She laid out steps not just for recovery, but for transformation. Her strategy embraced transparency, accountability, and a commitment to lifting every voice within the organization, especially those previously overshadowed. What once felt like a gathering dominated by narrow minds and old hierarchies began to feel like the first stirrings of a genuine turning point. There was no drama in her delivery, no raised voice to underscore her points. Yet the emotional depth of her words reached every corner of the room. Faces once flushed with superiority now softened with introspection. A few shifted uncomfortably, aware that their positions were no longer as secure as they had once believed. Others listened intently, eager to understand how they might align themselves with this new direction, how they might be part of rebuilding rather than resisting change. She spoke of creating pathways for talent that had been overlooked, of mentorship, programs designed to support growth from every level of the company. Her plans were not abstract ideals but tangible steps, clearly defined and actionable. With every word, she dismantled the invisible barriers that had kept voices like hers on the margins and built, in their place, a framework that welcomed diversity. not as a token gesture but as a genuine strength. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that her leadership was not merely justified, it was essential. She carried the weight of her role with ease, not because it was given to her, but because she had earned it long before she had ever stepped into that room. Her history, her experiences, and the quiet resilience she had shown in the face of scorn all combined to create a leader the company not only needed, but would come to respect deeply. Without fanfare, she concluded her address by outlining a bold vision for the future. Growth would no longer be measured solely by profit margins, but by the integrity of the company's practices and the strength of its people. She envisioned a culture where respect was the norm, where contributions were valued regardless of background, and where leadership was accessible to all who demonstrated the skill and heart to lead. As she finished, a thoughtful quiet settled over the room. There were no immediate applause, no performative gestures. What filled the space was far more meaningful, a collective recognition of the shift that had just taken place. Eyes that once looked at her with disdain now held a growing respect, not out of obligation, but out of an awakened understanding of the leader she truly was. Her gaze swept once more across the room, resting briefly on each face as if to silently acknowledge the journey ahead. She had not come to punish, but to elevate. She had not come to settle scores, but to build anew. In her steady presence and an unwavering commitment to dignity, she had turned a moment of prejudice into a powerful lesson on leadership. As the room slowly absorbed the weight of her words, there was a distinct shift, not just in posture or expression, but in something deeper, something harder to name. It was as if the walls themselves had exhaled, releasing the heavy breath held. Through years of silent prejudice and overlooked dignity, she remained seated at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly before her, her gaze steady yet far-reaching, as though she was already seeing beyond the confines of the moment. Her mind, too, drifted for a brief second to the long path that had brought her here. She remembered the quiet battles fought far from these glossy boardrooms, the endless moments of underestimation, the closed doors, the voices that once told her she didn't belong in places like this. Yet here she was, not as an outsider breaking in, but as the rightful leader shaping the future of an empire. The thought did not fill her with pride alone, but with an even deeper responsibility. Her eyes softened slightly as she scanned the faces before her. She knew they were processing not only her identity, but their own reflections within this moment. Without speaking, she let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel the full gravity of what had unfolded. It wasn't just about her appointment or their errors in judgment. It was about something far greater, a reckoning with the unspoken biases that had quietly directed their actions for too long. Slowly she began to speak again, not to dwell on the past, but to lift their eyes toward the horizon of possibility. Her words painted a future where collaboration replaced hierarchy, where every voice carried weight, and where leadership was recognized in character, not just in pedigree or background. She described an environment where innovation would spring from diversity of thought, and where respect would be the foundation of every interaction. The listeners, once quick to dismiss her, now clung to her every word. Their earlier arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw and genuine, a hunger to be part of the transformation she envisioned. She saw it in their eyes, the quiet understanding that this was no longer about damage control or corporate image. It was about rewriting the very story of who they were as a company and as individuals within it. Her attention briefly shifted to the young analyst at the far end of the table. He had been the first to sense the undercurrent, the first to see her not as an outsider, but as someone significant. She acknowledged him with a slight nod, an unspoken recognition of his integrity amidst the noise of prejudice. That simple gesture seemed to spark something in him, a flicker of newfound confidence, as though the future she described was already beginning to take root in him. She spoke next of building systems of accountability that extended beyond formal policies. True change, she explained, lived not in documents, but in daily choices. It was in the courage to question familiar patterns, to stand against quiet injustices, to uplift colleagues whose potential had been overshadowed by assumptions. Her voice carried warmth and firmness in equal measure, the sound of a leader not demanding respect, but naturally commanding it. With every sentence, she dismantled the walls of exclusion that had been built over years of complacency. Her vision wasn't just about policies or profits, it was about people. She described mentorship programs that would bring voices from all corners of the company into leadership pipelines, about safe spaces where ideas could flourish without fear of ridicule, and about creating pathways for those who had once felt invisible in the shadows of power. Faces around the table softened, eyes once filled with doubt, now lit by cautious hope. They were not yet fully transformed, but the cracks in their old perspectives had deepened into genuine openings. The culture that had seemed immovable now felt malleable, like clay in the hands of a sculptor willing to reshape it into something worthy of pride. Her final words in that moment were not a conclusion, but an invitation. She challenged them to see this not as a one-time correction, but as the beginning of an ongoing journey. She left space for them to imagine their roles in this future, to step beyond their past behaviors, and embrace the opportunity for growth. Her leadership was not a crown she wore alone. It was a torch, extended for others to carry alongside her. As she finished, she did not lean back in her chair in triumph, nor did she seek approval in their reactions. She remained poised, her expression grounded and composed. The power in the room had shifted entirely, not through force or retribution, but through the undeniable strength of authenticity and vision. The executives, once so certain of their superiority, now found themselves looking inward. Some felt shame for their earlier behavior, others determination to change, but all felt the undeniable gravity of the moment. They understood that the future of their company would be shaped not by clinging to outdated hierarchies, but by embracing the values she so naturally embodied. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, the day continued as usual. Phones rang, emails buzzed, deals awaited signatures. Yet inside, something had profoundly changed. They were no longer merely attendees of a routine corporate meeting. They were witnesses to a quiet revolution, led not by noise or spectacle, but by dignity, resilience, and undeniable purpose. Her gaze lingered a moment longer across the room, her eyes carrying both a promise and a challenge. Then, with the same steady grace she had shown from the very beginning, she rose from her seat, not in farewell, but as a leader ready to step into action. The room, as if stirred by an unseen current, followed her lead, rising not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. The legacy of that day would not be written in headlines or annual reports, but in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it. It would live on in every decision made with renewed awareness, in every promotion granted on merit, in every voice finally heard. As she stepped forward, leading them not just into the next chapter of their careers, but into a new era of their lives, there was no question left in anyone's mind. She was not simply the CEO. She was the change they never saw coming, and precisely the leader they needed.